The cockpit was barely wider than his shoulders. No engine controls, no landing gear, no radio to call for help. Lieutenant Kentaro Mitsuhashi sat in what was essentially a manned missile, listening to the bomber crew above him through a speaking tube, and he understood with perfect clarity that he had approximately 11 minutes to live. The temperature inside the Ohka was already unbearable. Outside, somewhere in the darkness over the East China Sea, American fighters were hunting. In his hand he held the release handle. Once pulled, there would be no turning back. The rocket would ignite. He would accelerate to 650 kilometers per hour. And then, if everything went according to plan, he would cease to exist in a burst of flame against an American warship. This is the story of the Ohka, Japan's rocket-powered kamikaze plane. But it is really about the moment when desperation becomes doctrine, when human lives become ammunition, and when technological innovation serves only to make death more efficient, and what it reveals about the distance between what nations tell themselves in crisis and what they are willing to sacrifice to avoid confronting the truth. March 1945. The Pacific War had become a mathematics problem Japan could not solve. American forces were closing on the home islands. Japanese naval aviation had been gutted at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Conventional attacks against American carriers were achieving hit rates below 3%. The planes were being shot down, the pilots were dying, and the ships kept coming. In this context of cascading failure, the Ohka was born, not from inspiration, but from exhaustion, not from strength, but from the terrifying realization that Japan was running out of options and still refusing to admit what that meant. To understand what happened when the Ohka entered service, you first need to understand what the men who designed it believed. They believed that Japanese spirit could compensate for material disadvantage, not supplement it, compensate for it. This was not merely propaganda. It was strategic doctrine woven into planning at every level. They believed that a weapon purpose built for suicide attack faster than anything the Americans could intercept would restore tactical advantage. They believed that technology could make human sacrifice more efficient, and that efficiency would somehow transform desperation into victory. They believed because the alternative was confronting a truth the empire had spent 4 years avoiding. Japan was losing a war it could not win, and every day of continued fighting was simply deciding how many more would die before the inevitable. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, meaning cherry blossom, was an elegant solution to an insoluble problem. Designed by a team led by Ensign Mitsuo Ota at the Navy Aeronautical Research Institute, it represented the logical endpoint of kamikaze doctrine. If pilots were going to die anyway, why waste a fighter plane in the process? Why not design something stripped to its essential purpose, carrying nothing but a pilot, a guidance system, and 200 kilograms of high explosive? The mathematics seemed compelling. A conventional kamikaze attack required getting a full-sized aircraft through American fighter screens and anti-aircraft fire. The Ohka would be carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber to within 30 kilometers of the target, then released at 7,000 meters. The pilot would glide toward the target, conserving the rocket fuel, then ignite the 3 solid fuel rockets at the final approach. Terminal velocity would reach 650 kilometers per hour in level flight, nearly 1,000 in a dive. No American fighter could catch it. No gunner could track it. The warhead was large enough to cripple a carrier. On paper, it was brilliant. But paper does not account for what happens when theory encounters reality, when engineering meets actual combat conditions, and when the gap between what you have designed and what you can actually execute becomes measured in lives. The first thing you need to understand about the Ohka is that it was not really an aircraft. It was a guided bomb with a human being replacing the guidance system, and that distinction mattered in ways the designers had not fully considered. The craft was tiny, just under 5 meters long, with a wingspan of 5 meters. The pilot sat in a cramped cockpit with minimal instrumentation, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a turn and bank indicator, and the rocket ignition switch. That was all. No radio, because communication was unnecessary for a one-way mission. No landing gear, because there would be no landing. The control surfaces were manually operated. No hydraulic assist, meaning that at high speed the pilot would be fighting tremendous control forces. The rockets, once ignited, burned for only 9 seconds. 9 seconds of thrust producing 800 kilograms force each, accelerating the Ohka to terminal velocity, after which the pilot had whatever momentum remained to reach the target. If he missed, there was no second chance. The fuel was gone. The speed would bleed away. He would simply fall into the ocean, conscious, trapped in a metal coffin waiting for impact. Lieutenant Kentaro Mitsuhashi had volunteered for the Jinrai Butai, the Thunder God's Corps, in February 1945. He was 23 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy, and like many of his generation, he had been raised on stories of samurai honor and the virtue of death over surrender. But volunteering for the Ohka was different from volunteering for conventional kamikaze duty. In a Zero or a bomber, you at least flew the aircraft to the target. You had agency, control, the ability to make decisions. In the Ohka, you were cargo until the moment of release. You sat in the dark fuselage of the Betty bomber, unable to see outside, unable to communicate except through the speaking tube, waiting for someone else to decide when you would die. Some of the Thunder Gods later admitted in private letters that the waiting was worse than the thought of death itself. The loss of control, the passivity, the sense of being an object rather than an actor. One pilot wrote to his family the night before a mission, "I am prepared to die for the Emperor. What I am not prepared for is sitting in darkness, listening to other men decide when I will die." This is not Bushido, this is something else. The operational concept for the Ohka required precision coordination between the Betty bomber crew and the Ohka pilot. The Betty would fly at high altitude to avoid fighter interception, with the Ohka pilot sealed in the bomb bay, waiting. When within range of the target, the Betty crew would notify the Ohka pilot through the speaking tube. The pilot would prepare for release. At the designated point, the Betty bombardier would pull the release handle and the Ohka would drop free. For the first few seconds, the Ohka pilot would be in an unpowered glide, adjusting his trajectory toward the target. This was the critical phase. If he misjudged the glide path, he would be too low or too far when the rockets ignited, and the attack would fail. If he ignited the rockets too early, he would run out of speed before reaching the target. If too late, he would be an easier target for anti-aircraft fire. The margin for error was nearly non-existent. And all of this assumed the Betty would survive long enough to reach the release point, which, as events would prove, was an assumption built on hope rather than tactical reality. March 21, 1945. Operation Tan No. 2. This was the first combat deployment of the Ohka, and it would reveal every fatal flaw in the concept. 18 Betty bombers, each carrying an Ohka beneath its fuselage, launched from Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu. Their target was the American fleet off Okinawa. The mission plan called for the Bettys to approach at high altitude, release the Ohkas at maximum range, and withdraw. 50 escorting Zero fighters would provide protection. The Thunder God's pilots climbed into their Ohkas on the ground, were sealed inside, and felt the Betty lift off beneath them. For the next hour they sat in darkness, listening to the engine noise, the wind, the speaking tube occasionally crackling with updates. And then, 100 kilometers from the target, the nightmare began. American radar had detected the formation. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Bennington and USS Hornet were already climbing to intercept. The Betty bomber, even without the Ohka, was not a fast aircraft. With a 2,000-kilogram bomb strapped underneath, it became dangerously sluggish. When the Hellcats arrived, the outcome was predetermined. The American pilots later described it as the easiest mission they had ever flown. The Bettys could not maneuver. The Ohkas made them tail heavy and unresponsive. The Zero escorts were outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed. One by one, the Bettys began to fall. Inside the Ohkas, the pilots had no idea what was happening. They heard the speaking tube go silent. They felt the aircraft shuddering, heard the engine pitch change, felt the sudden violent maneuvers as the Betty pilots tried desperately to evade. And then some of them felt the impact of cannon rounds tearing through the fuselage, felt the aircraft rolling, diving, burning. They were trapped inside a weapon they could not deploy, strapped into a coffin that was falling out of the sky, and there was nothing they could do. Not one Ohka was released. All 18 Bettys were shot down. 55 aircrewmen died. 18 Ohka pilots died, not in attacks against enemy ships, but trapped inside bombs that never launched, drowning in the cockpit or burning with the wreckage. 0 Ohkas reached the target. 0 American ships were hit. The Americans called it a turkey shoot. The Japanese called it a tactical postponement, but the Thunder Gods who survived the day in other units knew what it really was. Evidence that the Ohka was not a wonder weapon, but a death trap. Not just for the men who flew it, but for the men who carried it. But here is where the story becomes a study in institutional denial. After the disaster of March 21st, the rational response would have been to halt Ohka operations, reassess the concept, perhaps abandon it entirely. Instead, the Navy doubled down. More pilots were recruited, more Ohkas were built. The mission concept was barely modified. Why? Because abandoning the Ohka meant confronting what it represented. The admission that Japan had reached the point where it was designing weapons whose only purpose was to convert young men into explosives. Abandoning the Ohka meant admitting that desperation had become strategy, that human sacrifice was being systematized, industrialized, turned into a production line. So they continued. They told the pilots that the previous mission had been an anomaly, that tactics would be improved, that the next operation would succeed. They told them that their deaths would have meaning, that the Empire needed them, that history would remember their sacrifice. What they did not tell them was that the High Command already knew the Ohka was operationally ineffective, that the loss rate was unsustainable, and that they were sending men to die not because it would change the outcome of the war, but because stopping would mean acknowledging that the outcome was already decided. April 1st, 1945. Operation Kikusui No. 1. 6 Ohka equipped Bettys launched toward American ships off Okinawa. This time, the approach was different. The Bettys flew at low altitude to avoid early radar detection, hoping to get closer before being intercepted. It did not matter. The Americans had learned from the previous engagement. Picket destroyers with radar extended the detection range. Combat air patrols were thicker. The Bettys were detected 80 kilometers out. This time, 2 Ohkas were successfully released. Lieutenant Saburo Dohi and Lieutenant Katsumi Nagano became the first Thunder Gods to actually fly their weapons in combat. Dohi's Ohka malfunctioned. The rockets failed to ignite. He glided toward the American formation, controls heavy, speed bleeding away, and realized he was not going to make it. He struck the ocean 3 kilometers from the nearest destroyer, the impact killing him instantly. Nagano's rockets ignited. He accelerated to attack speed, lined up on the destroyer USS Manert El Abile, and executed the attack profile exactly as trained. The Ohka struck the ship just above the waterline, the 200-kilogram warhead detonating inside the hull. The Abele broke in half and sank in less than 5 minutes, taking 79 sailors with her. It was the only successful Ohka attack of the entire war. Nagano's success should have been a moment of vindication for the Thunder Gods Corps. Instead, it revealed the terrible arithmetic of the program. 55 men had died on March 21st for 0 hits. 12 men died on April 1st for 1 hit. The kill ratio was catastrophic. A single successful attack required an average of 67 Japanese deaths. And the Americans were learning. After the Abele sinking, radar picket lines were extended further. Combat air patrols were increased. Fighter direction became more sophisticated. The window for successful Ohka attack, already narrow, was closing. Over the following weeks, more missions were launched. More Bettys were shot down. More Ohka pilots died trapped inside weapons they never had the chance to use. By June 1945, when the Okinawa campaign ended, approximately 850 Ohka models had been built. Fewer than 100 were ever loaded onto Bettys for combat missions. Of those, only 74 were released toward targets. Of those 74, only 1 struck a ship. 1. The program had a success rate of 35%, and that single success had cost the lives of over 100 airmen. Now we need to slow down and understand something about the psychology of systems under terminal stress. When an organization is failing and cannot admit failure, it does not change course. It doubles down. It invests more resources into the failing strategy, not because the strategy is working, but because abandoning it would mean admitting that the previous investments were wasted, that the previous deaths were pointless. This is called sunk cost fallacy, and Japan in 1945 was drowning in it. Every kamikaze pilot who died represented a life that had to have meaning. Every Ohka that failed to reach its target represented a sacrifice that had to be honored. And the only way to honor those deaths, in the logic of the system, was to send more men to die in the same way. So even as the evidence mounted that the Ohka was ineffective, even as the loss rates became unsustainable, even as pilots began to quietly express doubts, the program continued. Because stopping meant confronting a question the Empire had been avoiding since 1942. If we cannot win this war, why are we still fighting? The Thunder Gods themselves were trapped in a psychological nightmare. Many had volunteered believing in the propaganda, believing their deaths would save Japan, believing the Ohka was a revolutionary weapon that would turn the tide. By mid-1945, that belief was collapsing. They saw the loss rates. They knew men who had died without ever launching. They heard the whispers that the war was already lost. But what do you do with that knowledge when you have already volunteered for a suicide weapon? How do you confront the possibility that your death will be meaningless? Some pilots coped by retreating into ritual, into poetry, into the formalism of Bushido. If they could not die effectively, they could at least die beautifully, with honor, in a way that conformed to the aesthetic tradition. Others coped by emotional shutdown, by becoming automata, by refusing to think about the larger strategic picture and focusing only on the immediate mission. And some could not cope at all. There are records of Thunder Gods pilots suffering psychological breakdowns, becoming unable to board the aircraft, weeping uncontrollably before missions. The military response was not compassion. It was shame. Those who showed weakness were told they were dishonoring their comrades, betraying the Emperor, failing in their duty. The system had no vocabulary for acknowledging that it was asking something inhuman. Lieutenant Kentaro Mitsuhashi flew his mission on June 22, 1945. By this point, the strategic situation was beyond salvage. Okinawa had fallen. The home islands were under direct bombardment. The Navy was nearly non-existent. The Ohka program was being continued not because it was effective, but because admitting its failure would require admitting larger failures. Mitsuhashi's Betty took off from Kanoya at dawn, carrying 5 other Ohka-equipped bombers in formation. The mission plan was the same as always: approach at altitude, release at maximum range, hope the escorts could hold off American fighters long enough. 50 kilometers from the target, the Hellcats found them. Mitsuhashi, sitting in his Ohka in the darkness, heard the speaking tube crackle. The Betty pilot's voice calmed despite the chaos. Prepare for release. 10 seconds. Mitsuhashi gripped the control stick. He had trained for this moment for 4 months. He knew the attack profile. He knew the characteristics of the Ohka. He knew that his family would be told he died a hero. He did not know that the Betty above him had already been hit, that the port engine was on fire, that the pilot was trying to maintain altitude long enough to release the Ohka before the aircraft became uncontrollable. 5 seconds. The speaking tube went dead. The Betty was dying, and in that moment Mitsuhashi made a choice. The release handle could only be pulled from inside the Betty. The bombardier was supposed to do it, but the bombardier was dead or incapacitated. The Ohka was still attached, and Mitsuhashi, sitting in his cockpit, realized that he was going to die, but not the way he had imagined, not in a glorious attack, not striking the enemy. He was going to die trapped in this metal shell attached to a burning bomber falling into the ocean. He tried to open the cockpit. The mechanism was jammed or damaged. He tried to signal through the speaking tube. Silence. The Betty rolled inverted. He felt the G-forces, felt the airframe shuddering. He felt the heat from the fire above. He felt the terrible understanding that his death would not even be recorded as an Ohka loss, because the Ohka was never released. He would be listed as a Betty crewman, a footnote, erased from the Thunder Gods roster. The bomber hit the water at over 400 kilometers per hour. The Ohka, still attached, broke apart on impact. Mitsuhashi died instantly, crushed by forces no human body could survive, and the ocean swallowed the wreckage without ceremony. In the final months of the war, the Navy developed 3 more variants of the Ohka, each attempting to solve the fatal flaw of the original, the vulnerability of the Betty carrier. The Model 11, the original, was the only version to see combat. The Model 22 was designed with a longer glide range and a turbojet engine instead of rockets, allowing release from further away. Only 50 were built before the war ended. None saw combat. The Model 33 was a smaller version designed to be carried by the Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga bomber, which was faster and more maneuverable than the Betty. Production had barely begun when the war ended. The Model 43 was to be launched from submarines or coastal caves, skipping across the water like a missile. It never left the drawing board. Every variant was an attempt to fix a problem that had no technical solution. You cannot design your way out of desperation. You cannot engineer a weapon so efficient at killing its operator that it becomes strategically viable. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, approximately 850 Ohkas had been manufactured. The Americans captured several hundred intact specimens after the occupation. They studied them carefully, tested them, analyzed the concept. Their conclusion was documented in technical intelligence reports. The Ohka represented innovative engineering applied to a fundamentally flawed operational concept. The weapon itself was well designed for its purpose, but the purpose was unachievable. The requirement to carry it under a slow, vulnerable bomber negated any advantage the Ohka's speed provided. The one-way nature of the mission removed any possibility of pilot learning or tactical evolution. The psychological burden on the pilots reduced effectiveness. And the strategic context, Japan's overwhelming material disadvantage, meant that even a theoretically perfect suicide weapon could not alter the war's trajectory. The Americans gave the Ohka a reporting name, Baka, Japanese for fool. It was not a technical designation. It was an assessment. After the war, many surviving Thunder Gods struggled with survivor's guilt and the question of meaning. Some had been scheduled for missions that were cancelled due to weather or aircraft availability. They lived because of chance, while friends died in attacks that accomplished nothing. In post-war interviews, several themes emerged repeatedly. First, anger at the leadership that had designed and perpetuated the program despite its obvious failure. Second, grief over comrades who died not heroically but pointlessly, trapped in weapons that malfunctioned or were shot down before launch. Third, a profound disillusionment with the concepts of honor and sacrifice that had been used to justify sending them to die. And fourth, a haunting question. If we had been allowed to fight conventionally, flying real aircraft with the possibility of return, could we have been more effective? Could those deaths have meant something? The answer, based on the overall strategic situation, was almost certainly no. But the question itself reveals the psychological damage of being turned into ammunition. The Ohka program cost Japan approximately 440 lives, including pilots, bomber crews, and escort fighters lost in Ohka-related operations. In exchange, it sank one destroyer and damaged several other vessels with near misses. The resource cost was also significant. The manufacturing capacity used to build Ohkas could have produced conventional fighters or bombers. The training infrastructure used for Thunder Gods pilots could have produced fleet aviators. The Betty bombers used as carriers were desperately needed for reconnaissance and transport. Every resource diverted to the Ohka was a resource not used for something potentially more effective. But effectiveness was not really the point by 1945. The Ohka was symbolic. It was a demonstration that Japan was still willing to fight, still willing to sacrifice, still committed to the principle that death was preferable to surrender. It was a weapon designed not to win the war, but to delay confronting the fact that the war was already lost. Here is the part of the story where we need to step back and consider what the Ohka reveals about human systems under existential stress. Japan in 1945 was a nation that had built its entire modern identity around the mythology of martial superiority, unbroken imperial lineage, and divine destiny. Losing the war did not just mean military defeat. It meant the collapse of a worldview, the destruction of a national narrative, the admission that everything the population had been taught and had sacrificed for was based on illusions. In that context, the Ohka makes a terrible kind of sense. It was not designed to win. It was designed to allow the myth to continue a little longer. It was designed to provide a framework where young men could die in a way that the culture could narrate as meaningful, even as the strategic meaninglessness became undeniable. It was a technological solution to a narrative problem. How do you maintain the story of honorable resistance when the material reality is collapse? You create weapons that convert men into symbols, and you call it Bushido. But symbols are not strategy. Narrative is not capability. And the gap between what Japan told itself about the Ohka and what the Ohka actually was destroyed lives without changing outcomes. Kentaro Mitsuhashi was one of 440 men who died in that gap, crushed between the myth of the thunder gods and the reality of obsolete bombers carrying one-way weapons into fighter screens they could not penetrate. The Ohka pilots were not fools. They were victims of a system that had made foolishness into doctrine, that had mistaken desperation for innovation, that had convinced itself that willingness to die was a substitute for the capacity to win. The American pilots who shot down the Bettys rarely felt they were facing a fearsome weapon. They felt they were conducting an execution. One F-6F pilot wrote in his diary after downing an Ohka-equipped Betty, "It was not a fight. It was not even a challenge. It was just sad. They are killing themselves because they cannot kill us." The technical lessons of the Ohka were absorbed into post-war weapons development. The concept of the anti-ship missile, a high-speed guided weapon designed to overwhelm naval defenses, became central to Cold War naval strategy. But those missiles did not carry pilots. They carried guidance systems that could learn, adjust, return data, improve with each iteration. They were weapons that could evolve. The Ohka could not. It was frozen in time, a snapshot of a moment when a nation had run out of good options and convinced itself that death could be weaponized efficiently enough to matter. It could not. The Ohka's legacy is not its single successful attack. It is the 439 men who died failing to attack, and the question their deaths pose. At what point does continuing to fight become not courage, but cruelty? At what point does honoring the dead require stopping the creation of more dead? At what point does a system's refusal to admit failure become more destructive than the failure itself? Lieutenant Kentaro Mitsuhashi's family received notification of his death in July 1945. They were told he had died honorably in combat, that he had given his life for the emperor, that his sacrifice would be remembered. They were not told he had died trapped in an Ohka that never launched, that his weapon never struck anything, that his death accomplished nothing measurable. They were not told that the leadership knew the Ohka program was failing and continued it anyway. They were not told that their son had been converted into ammunition and expended in a strategy built on denial. These things were not said because they could not be said. To say them would be to tear away the only consolation the system could offer, the narrative that the deaths meant something. But meaning is not assigned by narrative. Meaning is determined by outcome. And the outcome of the Ohka program was clear. It prolonged the war by 0 days. It sank one ship. It killed 440 Japanese servicemen and 79 American sailors. And it demonstrated that when a system becomes invested in its own mythology, it will sacrifice lives to maintain the story, rather than face the truth that the story is over. The Ohka was not a wonder weapon. It was an epitaph. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that had spent its strength, exhausted its options, and refused to admit what that meant. It was engineering in service of denial, innovation in service of prolonging the inevitable. It was what happens when courage is separated from wisdom, when sacrifice is separated from purpose, when honor becomes an excuse for extending suffering. The men who flew the Ohka were not fools. The system that created the Ohka, that perpetuated it despite evidence of failure, that sent men to die in it after its ineffectiveness was proven, that system was something worse than foolish. It was tragic. It was the demonstration that organizations under existential threat do not become more rational. They become less. They cling to narratives that provide comfort even as reality screams contradiction. They sacrifice the living to honor the dead, creating more dead to honor, a cycle that ends only when external force intervenes or internal collapse becomes total. This is the story the Ohka tells. Not the story Japan told itself about thunder gods and cherry blossoms and beautiful death. The real story. The story of what happens when a nation builds weapons to serve a myth it can no longer afford to question. The story of men who volunteered to become ammunition because the culture gave them no vocabulary for refusal. The story of a system that measured its commitment not by effectiveness, but by willingness to destroy itself. And the story of the distance between what we tell ourselves we are doing and what we are actually doing. A distance measured in lives, in wasted potential, in young men turned to wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific, memorialized in ceremonies that never acknowledged the truth of how and why they died. Kentaro Mitsuhashi was 23 when he climbed into the Ohka for the last time. He believed what he had been taught to believe, that his death would matter, that sacrifice was virtue, that the empire was worth dying for. The Ohka did not give him time to learn differently. It sealed him in darkness, attached him to a dying bomber, and dropped him into the ocean still strapped inside a weapon that never reached its target. His name is carved on a memorial at Kanoya, along with the other thunder gods, honored as heroes. But honor is what we give the dead when we cannot give them justice. Justice would have been a system that admitted failure, that stopped the program, that told young men the truth about what they were being asked to die for and gave them the choice to refuse. Instead, the system gave them mythology and ceremony and a one-way ticket to oblivion. The Ohka was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of despair, mistaking itself for hope. And that may be the saddest thing about it. Not that it failed, but that it was designed to fail and they flew it anyway, and we built monuments instead of learning.